urgent, the security service of Ukraine has struck a major oil terminal in the Black Sea region, and how in France the Shadow Fleet tanker was released after the payment of a fine. We'll talk about this with Oleksandr Kraiev, expert at Ukrainian Prism think tank, senior lecturer at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Oleksandr, glad to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Ukraine should come to the table for negotiations quickly. US President Donald Trump told reporters aboard Air Force One when asked about a new round of talks between Ukraine and Russian representatives mediated by the United States. Trump described the negotiations as big but did not provide further details. In a Telegram post announcing that the Ukrainian delegation had already arrived in Geneva, President Volodymyr Zelensky pointed out that Russia cannot resist the temptation in the final days of winter cold and wants to strike painfully at Ukrainians. How is this currently being perceived by international partners? What exactly did Donald Trump mean by urging Ukraine to come to the table quickly, given that the Ukrainian delegation is already participating in the negotiations?
Well, as of now, I do see that the American side of the deal is currently employing the willful blindness to the issues that Russians are trying to sabotage the negotiations, just because, let me remind you, of course, in aspects, the great quote of Marco Rubio during one of the Senate hearings, when he was asked why he hesitated to call Vladimir Putin a war criminal. He said bluntly that how can you expect us to call somebody a war criminal if we want to make a deal with him? So basically, I do believe that the same strategy is being applied as of now. Basically, the Americans are trying to turn a blind eye on anything that can sabotage the process of negotiation, and they're trying to get the results as fast as possible and in any possible manner. Basically, I don't see any specific willingness of the American side to take part in this. They're just trying to get the deal done. They're just trying to implement the same scenario they have already tried with Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, or in the case with Thailand and Cambodia, or even in the case with Israel and Hamas, where they just get the deal done and then they can just forget about any present problems or any new arising threats from this conflict. And basically the same thing is being conducted as of now. It's just business for American administration to be a moderator. It's not about moral deterrence of the possible next aggression. It's not about making a successful ceasefire regime. It's just about making any kind of ceasefire regime to claim that the deal is done and the deal is here.
Oleksandr, earlier, Ukrainian Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council Rustem Umerov stated that the Ukrainian side would raise the issue of another temporary halt to strikes on energy infrastructure during the trilateral talks with the United States and Russia in Geneva. Russia previously used temporary moratoriums on energy strikes in March, April 2025 and January, February 2026 to accumulate drones and missiles for subsequent large-scale attacks. The Kremlin urged to a moratorium on strikes against certain Ukrainian energy facilities in January-February 2026, only after inflicting significant damage on Ukrainians' power grid. Could the Kremlin attempt at this time, for example, to portray its compliance with the future short-term moratorium as a major concession, and your own expectation if we're talking about these negotiations?
Once again, let us be more on the realistic, even cynical side of things here. What is the reason for Russia to abstain from doing this kind of things? What is the reason for them to try to play nice? Because they haven't been playing nice since forever. They're not trying to be on the good side of Trump. They tried it before Anchorage meeting in August last year. They tried to be more open to negotiations back then. And back then they were more on the propaganda side of issues, trying to portray themselves as a peacemakers and quote unquote the one willing for negotiations. But as of now, as the negotiations are on the roll, as we see more and more meetings not only being planned but also being implemented and conducted trilaterally, as we see that less and less information is being poured about the actual things talked about during this negotiation, which is in classical diplomacy is a very good sign that something serious is being talked about and some major results are coming in. So what's the reason for them as of now to adhere to anything that Trump is proposing? Basically, I do not see any possibilities that Trump or the American administration or generally the United States of America will retaliate against Russia if they will breach this ceasefire or if they will break some kind of an accord before the ceasefire. So yeah, I do believe that Russians may play this informational card, for example, portraying Ukraine as an aggressor in this regard or making some kind of the amendments to their rhetoric. But at the end of the day, I do not believe that Russians are capable of holding to these honest words. They're not capable of being truthful not only to the Americans but also to themselves. So one way or another, I do not see any possibility for them to stop with these attacks, and I do not see any reason for them to do so, because we should understand that such an attack is not only a sabotaging tactics for the negotiations themselves, it's also a kind of leverage against Ukrainian delegation. It's a psychological push against our representatives, our diplomats and our politicians in order to scare them or just to drag them into the position where they have no other option but to acquiesce to some kind of the agreement. So in that case, once again, there is no reasonable, from Russian reasoning, reasonable reason to get along with Trump's demands, because one way or another, Trump will not retaliate for breaking such demands.
While we wait for Trump to effectively pressure Russia, we are taking action ourselves with our drones. Drones operated by the Special Operations Center, Alpha, of the Security Service of Ukraine have struck the infrastructure of the Tamanivtygaz oil terminal in Russia's Krasnodar region for the second time in the past month. This port is one of the largest in the Black Sea region and plays a key role in the transshipment of oil, gas, ammonia, its storage capacity for petroleum products and liquefied gas exceeds 1 million cubic meters. How do such drone strikes increase pressure on Russia? What tangible impact do they have on Russia's energy exports, logistics change, and overall wartime economy?
It's all about playing a long run here, because when we speak about Russia being incomprehensibly cynical in its diplomatic relations, we should also point out that Russia is not indestructible from the economic or military side of issues. So basically creating a situation where Russian war machine and Russian industry cannot feasibly in any long distance planning contribute to Russian efforts on the front line. When we are creating a situation where Russian economy cannot sustain the losses that it currently has, and when the Russian economy as a whole cannot supplement the Russian army enough to continue with the onslaught on that scale, we should understand that it is the only leverage, it is the only possible instrument to get Russia to negotiate honestly. Apart from that, I do not see any other possible scenario when Russian diplomats will play along with our delegation and with the American diplomats. So basically, that's the only reasoning that can get Putin to the negotiating table and can get them to sign something instrumental, to sign something that will work, not something that can be just thrown apart the next day after the negotiation is finished. So strikes inside Russian territory, strikes against Russian economy, especially export-oriented economy, and which is even more important, export towards China-oriented facilities, because as of now we do see that China attracts more than 73% of all the mineral exports of Russian Federation, and basically China remains the only market that is open for Russian resources and Russian financial assets. In that regard, I do believe that's the only way to bring Russia to the diplomatic solution in a good way. So that's the only way that Ukraine can not only slow down the Russian onslaught. As I stated earlier, that's also a military side of the issues to these strikes. But also, it's the only way that Ukraine can get Russia to behave itself, if you can put it this way.
Oleksandr, we saw that France has released the Russian Shadow Fleet tanker Grinch, which had been seized in January. The prosecutor's office lifted the vessel's arrest after the owning company paid a fine of several million euros, according to French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot. Could this precedent affect future EU actions regarding the freezing or seizure of Russian ships?
Fortunately, yes, because it just provides for a precedent when Russians can just pay off for all their sins and crimes and just move on with business as usual. So that's something that alt-left and alt-right in Europe are talking about for several years, that yes, okay, Russians are war criminals, Russian economy is supplying the destruction of lives and livelihoods of Ukrainians, but still, if they pay a price, they must be clean. So basically, it's just a money laundering scheme for Russians and money laundering scheme for their so-called partners in European countries. Unfortunately, and that's the part when I should make some praise for the Americans here, unfortunately, the only possible and effective way to deal with Russian ghost fleet is just to seize the tankers, approach them as a terrorist objects who support terrorist regimes, use Navy SEALs or Delta teams to seize these assets and just move them to neutral or to your own ports. So any kind of lawful procedure, unfortunately, create a loophole for these companies, because starting 2015, most of Russian companies or assets are not registered within Russia. They are registered in Cyprus, they are registered on the Cayman Islands, on Virgin Islands, wherever else in the world there is a good tax haven, the Russians will get there. So basically, if we want to be effective here, and if Europeans want to be effective here, they need to be more hard-on approach. They need to be more realistic, and basically they should be very adult with their decisions, because you cannot leave the criminal to roam around just because he have some additional pocket change to let himself free.
Oleksandr, the president of Ukraine recently emphasized the need for the United States to actively cooperate with the European Union, not only to detain tankers of Russia's Shadow Fleet, but also to seize the oil they are transporting. What do you think about United States of America role?
Well, the Americans set the precedent, as that's basically it. Because let us not forget that when they were seizing Russian tankers, when they were capturing this fleet in the Caribbean and in the Atlantic Ocean, they never said they're acting against Russian Shadow Fleet. They were always emphasizing that these particular vessels are Venezuela directed or Venezuela owned, or just helping Maduro regime to sustain itself. So basically, the Americans, unfortunately for us, they were circumventing the topic of Russia as much as possible. And they were trying not to blame Russia for this shadow fleet. They were not trying to make a link between these tankers and Russian Putin's terrorist regime. So they were seizing them as a part of Venezuela government regime. In that regard, that's the whole role of the Americans. They just showed us and everybody in the world that Russians, even with the presence of their military vessels in the region, even with the presence of the military submarine just around the corner, basically, they will not react to it. They will just leave their people be. They will just blame everybody else for their mistakes or for their losses, and they will just carry on. So basically, the idea here is that the Americans showed us and showed Europeans that we can take those ships, we can do with them whatever we want, and Russia will not retaliate. And that's the main point here. But unfortunately, they never make the link of these shadow tankers specifically to Russian government and Russian owned companies. So I do believe we need somebody like Great Britain. We need somebody strong enough and at the same time courageous enough to be the first European-based nation and European-based military to conduct the same operation, but flag those ships specifically as a part of Russian Shadow Fleet. We saw the same operation being conducted in the Baltics several months ago. Unfortunately, once again, they were let free with a fine and with several court proceedings. They were not held in custody indefinitely, but we also have a similar precedent. So I do believe we need somebody strong and courageous enough in Europe to act in the same way. I do believe that Ukrainian security services, for example, the Security Service of Ukraine or the main intelligence institution of Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, will be very glad to help our European partners with information, intelligence, with personnel, with necessary equipment. But once again, it needs to be done by the Europeans themselves.
Oleksandr, you mentioned China. China has offered Ukraine new humanitarian and energy assistance to mitigate the impact of Russian strikes, but at the same time secretly funds Russia's military apparatus aimed at destroying Ukrainians' energy infrastructure. As Fox News reports, U.S. Ambassador to NATO Matthew Whitaker accused Beijing of having the ability to stop Russia's invasion, but choosing not to. Whitaker said China could call Vladimir Putin and end this war tomorrow by stopping the sale of its dual-use technologies. China could stop buying Russian oil and gas. You know, this war is fully supported by China. What diplomatic levers could compel Beijing to choose a clear stance in the war? How do you think?
China is the only one who can definitely influence Russian Federation on the scale that will contribute to the ending of the hostilities. China has all the leverage, economic, political, and military leverage to stop Russian aggression. However, as of now, for China, it is much more beneficial and profitable just to let Russia roam around and destroy Western capabilities, which in other case may be used against People's Liberation Army of Chinese People's Republic, for example, in a scenario of a possible conflict in Taiwan or somewhere else in Southeastern Asia or in the Pacific. So basically the idea here is that China is still trying to, on the one hand, weaken the Western powers with Russian aggression, weaken their resolve and destroy the notion of the collective West. Unfortunately, China was very successful in that. And on the other hand, China is just conducting a full-fledged experiment. They're just researching how the Western powers will react to any kind of the border dispute or any kind of the attempt to change the currently existing borders. And Russian aggression against Ukraine is a great experimental example for them. And unfortunately for us, we are just in the center of that experiment. And for this humanitarian help on Chinese side, well, China is known for this two-faced diplomacy because on the one hand, they have been talking about the respect and preservation of the currently existing borders. However, they never noted whose specific borders are they talking about, because Chinese volunteers have been met within the Russian prisoners of war. Chinese journalists were together with Russian forces entering Mariupol in the first year of the full-scale invasion. So basically, China has its allegiance towards Russia, but at the same time, China is trying to portray itself as a neutral player who just trying to achieve world peace and to help everybody at the same time. So unfortunately, China is not our ally. China may be our biggest trade partner, but we should not build any pink dreams about China being on the side of the good in this conflict. China is always fighting for one interest and one interest only, and that is Chinese interest.
Oleksandr, Russia is attempting to shift its oil exports from India to China. The shipments to China have been rising for the third consecutive month, and declining demand from India, which had been a key buyer of Russian oil. How sustainable is the growing demand from China for Russian oil in the current geopolitical and economic context? And what about India?
Fortunately for Russia, China has a lot more opportunities and a lot more alternatives to Russia than India does. So basically, China has a long range of additional treaties being implemented with the Gulf states, and a lot of treaties implemented with the OPEC countries. So basically, they have some opportunity to diversify themselves from the Russian imports. But at the same time, as long as they could use this cheap extract, as long as Russia is ready to provide great sale prices for their oil, China will use it. But we should be aware that unfortunately for Russia, China has other opportunities and other possibilities and can dump Russians at any point in time. So China is strategically important for Russian survival, economical survival. However, Russia is not that important for Chinese economic flourishing and Chinese economic development. So in that case, it's not a partnership of equals. It's rather China using Russian dire economic and resource state for its own benefits.
Oleksandr, thank you so much for the professional analysis and valuable insights. We were joined live by Oleksandr Kraiev, expert at Ukrainian Prism think tank, senior lecturer at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. We wish you all the best and see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.